Dexter was/is a really weird show, but not for the obvious reasons. I mean, it's literally a show about a serial killer that you want to root for because he's the main protagonist. What makes it really weird has nothing to do with that. See, it's not that it's a show starring a killer. It's not that the original series had an ending so bad it only got overshadowed by season 8 of Game of Thrones and was so universally disliked that they actually came out with an entire extra season called Dexter New Blood, which was frankly amazing and felt like an ending that was a million times better. And it's not even that weird that they're taking a note from the Big Bang Theory and how they did Young Sheldon, and now they're making a prequel series for Dexter called Dexter Original Sin, which is about Dexter and his growing up and developing as a serial killer age. Now, there's kind of a random thing that's weird about it, but I'm getting ahead of myself. So buckle in, hit subscribe, and let's talk about Dexter. Now, I loved this show. It actually became my comfort show for a while, where I would frequently put it on to fall asleep to, since I've seen the entire series from beginning to end multiple times at this point. That might say something about my psychological well-being, that the show about a serial killer is comforting to me, but that's for a psychologist to decide. Now, I will warn you that we will be hitting some major spoilers, but there will be timestamps down below so you can skip around as you need to. Dexter was originally based off the novel series Darkly Dreaming Dexter, written by Jeff Lindsay. And remember that name because it's going to be important later. We get introduced to the show by the iconic intro that hints at so many killing methods, all just during a usual morning routine. And despite shaving in the intro of Dexter, Dexter always has a 5 o'clock shadow, which is apparently because Michael C. Hall, who plays Dexter, had gotten so sick of having to shave constantly for his previous hit show, 6 Feet Under, where he was required to be clean shaven on such a regular basis, he actually requested to not be required to shave for this role. And as a man with sensitive Irish skin, I can understand that. Then we get season 1, which sets the pace for most of the show with 2 storylines: the episodic story and the season-long story. Where a show like Buffy had Monster of the Week, Dexter had more of a kill of the week, and there being about 1 kill per episode, sometimes more, sometimes less, with the occasional bye week in case he needed a week off from killing. And we're introduced to Dexter's methods with a kill that everyone can agree with: Mike Donovan. Because part of why Dexter is different than your average run-of-the-mill killer is that he only kills bad people. And Mike Donovan is apparently a youth pastor who's been doing exactly what you would assume that a youth pastor who's doing bad things would have done. And we even get a quick note about Dexter's code with their interaction when Donovan asks Dexter to understand. And he surprisingly says he does understand, but his standards could never let him hurt a child. So Donovan gets the slice. Then we get a great introduction to some of the crew, because Dexter gets a call from his foster sister, Deborah Morgan, aka Deb. Random side note, soon after Dexter started, Michael C. Hall, who played Dexter, and Jennifer Carpenter, who played Deb, started dating in real life, and soon after got married. Deb is working for Vice for Miami Metro Police Department, and she went undercover as an escort. And saying that Deb swears like a sailor as a character would be a massive underrepresentation of her general excessive mouth. She wants some help from Dexter because there's been a murder, and she really wants to work for the homicide department and move out of Vice. Knowing Dexter is a blood spatter analyst for the forensics team at Miami Metro Homicide, she wants him to help her investigate what is assumed to be a serial killer, targeting these ladies of the night. I have to use random phrases there because it's YouTube and they like to flag certain things. And I'm already going to be lucky if YouTube doesn't demonetize a video about a serial killer show. Dexter goes to check out the body, where we start getting introduced to the Miami Metro cast of characters with Vince Masuka, another non-cop but forensic member of Miami Metro, who's known to be insanely pervy and make overly innuendoed jokes. Then we get Angel Batista, a very solid detective with a few faults, but he's realistic. And they're actually surprised that Dexter is even there because he's a blood spatter analyst, but there's no blood. And that just makes Dexter all the more interested in the case. Then back at the police station, throughout this episode, we get to meet a couple more members of Miami Metro PD, meeting Sergeant James Dokes, a detective who's former military and happens to really have it out for Dexter, and Lieutenant Maria LaGuerta, basically everyone's boss, but not so subtly hits on Dexter on more than one occasion in this first season, but that doesn't really lead to anything because there's one other final major character that gets introduced right away, and it just so happens to not be a member of Miami Metro, and that's Dexter's girlfriend, Rita Bennett, played by Julie Benz, a mother of two who's got a pretty troubled past, making her understandably closed off, but that actually works for Dexter because he's super cool with that because he's got his own issues and he gets kind of worried that getting too close to people will reveal his darker side. Then we get Dexter pulling off another kill, but then immediately afterwards, Dexter sees a refrigerated truck, which we just so happen to have figured out that that's probably how the killer who had the bloodless victim transporting the bodies. And what do you know? It's the killer's truck, and he throws a head at Dexter's car. Dexter chats with the police, gets hit on by his boss again in the most weird time for that to happen, and then later finds a doll head attached to his fridge with the rest of the doll pieces in his freezer. But Dexter's killer mind sees this as more of a game, and he gets kind of excited about it. Throughout this season, we get some development with Rita as her abusive ex shows up, but Dexter makes that problem disappear by planting drugs on him. And more importantly, we're shown more of why Dexter is the way that he is. Because when he was 3 years old, he was locked in a storage container where his mother was murdered, and he was basically sitting in blood for God knows how long until the police came. The policeman that found him, Harry Morgan, wound up adopting him and tried to raise him the best he could, but saw that Dexter was showing some more psycho killer tendencies, and then he decides, well, if he's gonna do it anyways, I might as well make him really, really good at it and teach him a code so he only kills bad people. We get even more insights into this code thanks to an internal monologue from Dexter in conversations with his now deceased adoptive father in his head. And we also get plenty of moments of Dexter's imagination running wild in a few clips, which is far more fun and slightly comedic in this first season, but stays much more serious in basically every other season. Then we get plenty more kills this season. We get Deb fawning over a couple guys until she winds up meeting a guy named Rudy, who very obviously is important for other reasons, which as the audience you pick up on very quickly because of his generally creepy demeanor. Dexter's past continues to reveal itself to both Dexter and the audience as it turns out that Dexter's birth father dies, which is super surprising to Dexter since his adoptive father, Harry, had told him he died a long time ago. Dexter keeps digging, finds out his birth mother was an informant for his adoptive father, and they probably hooked up, which is a bit of something you might want to deal with in some therapy. And that's mostly what got her killed, is being that informant. Then on top of everything else, Dexter wasn't alone in that storage container. He had an older brother, Brian Moser. And surprise, surprise, Brian Moser is Rudy, Deb's new boyfriend, who proposes to her insanely early, but Deb is super swept up and immediately says yes, only for him to use her to try and reconnect with his brother Dexter by offering her to him as a killable gift. Dexter's like, no thanks, I got a code now, and kills Rudy, aka Brian, instead. This is honestly an awesome first season and a great intro for most of the world around Dexter. I kind of wish there was more comedic imagination scenes that stuck around in future seasons. We get one or two of them in season 2, but they do make more appearances much, much later. Then in season 2, we get to pick up with the aftermath of season 1. Deb is emotionally traumatized and living with Dexter, and simultaneously dealing with that by working out non-stop. Detective James Dokes has gotten crazy obsessive about Dexter and convinced he's hiding something because he just has a feeling about it. He literally has zero evidence, he just got a gut feeling. But between Dokes' obsession about him and his sister constantly being at his house, Dexter gets basically no killing done and is really getting that itch. The guy just needs a bit of a break from family and work to go commit a murder. And just in case that wasn't enough, Rita's ex tries to convince her that he's innocent and those drugs that Dexter planted on him weren't his, which is technically true. When Dexter planted it on him, he knocked him out and he left his shoe behind because that's the only thing that the police didn't find. Totally in belief that finding that shoe will miraculously get him out of jail, which I don't know why Rita bothers listening to any of this. This ex was so insanely terrible to her in every way imaginable, but yet for some reason she still listens to him despite the fact that Dexter, who has been an amazing person to her in every aspect as far as she's concerned, has done nothing wrong, and she's just listening to her terrible, terrible ex. But it's just enough to get her thinking about things a little differently. But that ex gets all pissy about it in jail, winds up starting a fight that leads to getting himself killed. Rita then confronts Dexter because she's so upset about the whole situation, and Dexter doesn't really see a great way out of it. So he confesses that he did set up the ex, but apparently that wasn't super well thought out because Rita starts to question more about the drugs that were planted on him and is immediately convinced that Dexter is an addict like her ex was. Dexter, being kind of stuck in a lie, has to go with that idea and agrees to go to an Addicts Anonymous meeting. And because Dokes was following him, he sees Dexter going into the meeting, assumes that what his instincts were telling him about Dexter is actually him being an addict. So he finally lets off on Dexter a bit, but not for too long. Dexter actually tries to treat his serial killer tendencies like an addiction, which is honestly a really cool concept that I liked that they explored. And he even gets a sponsor. Introduce Lila Turnay. And then, just to really amp things up, some random scuba divers just so happen to stumble upon where Dexter dumps his bodies after pretty much all of his kills. And tons of bodies are found, and he's dubbed the Bay Harbor Butcher. The police wind up figuring out that all of the bodies recovered have something in common. They're all really bad people. They're all murderers. And when this comes to light, people start supporting him in the public. And there's even a comic book that comes out about Dexter, obviously not knowing that it is Dexter, but they start dubbing him the Dark Defender. But because of all of the attention and the sheer number of bodies, the FBI is brought in, which really puts a lot of heat on Dexter. Dexter tries to both sabotage this investigation while at the same time taking his murder sobriety very seriously. Rita begins to get really jealous of Lila, his sponsor, and then just so happens to hear a voicemail out of context that makes her think that Dexter cheated when he didn't, and she immediately freaks out, doesn't listen to him, and dumps him. Dexter is really upset, starts spiraling, goes to Lila, and then actually sleeps with her. Rita suddenly realizes she may have jumped to some conclusions and decides to hear Dexter out. And Dexter's like, well, I didn't cheat on you, but after you dumped me, I did go and sleep with her. She's not too happy about that and immediately sticks to the whole broken up thing. Dexter continues to see Lila despite the fact that Deb really doesn't like her, but surprise, surprise, the really hot addict with a sketchy past, yeah, she's toxic as hell and secretly a pyromaniac. Dexter randomly finds out that his adoptive father didn't actually die of natural causes, but more of a self-inflicted nature after he realizes that he turned Dexter into what he is. Dokes starts getting really over the top towards Dexter, so Dexter tricks him into assaulting him in the middle of a police station. Then Dexter cuts off Lila, gets back with Rita, and Deb winds up falling for a much older FBI investigator. But they really acknowledge the age difference, so it doesn't seem quite as weird, but mostly just because it's straight up called out and acknowledged. It makes it a little better. Dokes goes completely rogue, breaks into Dexter's place, steals his blood slides, which are basically his trophies from all of his kills, but when the police later find them in Dokes' car, they assume that he's the Bay Harbor Butcher instead of Dexter, meaning that Dexter just got insanely lucky. Dokes isn't exactly happy about this and catches Dexter right when he's kind of in the middle of some murdery stuff. Dexter manages to knock out Dokes and lock him up, while also forcing him to witness his killing ritual. Dexter doesn't initially know what to do because Dokes doesn't meet the code since he's not a murderer. He tries to come up with some justification, Dokes breaks free, and they have to fight off some random bad guys together for some great male bonding time, but then Dexter locks him back up and realizes that he can't break the code. So he decides he's actually going to turn himself in and release Dokes. But he wants to get his affairs in order first, because if you're going to wind up being charged with murder, you got to make sure all of your stuff goes to the right people and everybody's taken care of, I guess. While he's trying to do all that, though, it's time for the crazy ex-girlfriend to chime in because she uses the GPS from Dexter's car, finds the cabin Dokes is being held at, and Dokes is like, oh, sweet, somebody's here to save me. Dexter is the Bay Harbor Butcher. And Lila's like, oh, poor Dexter. I need to help him. So she blows up the cabin with Dokes inside. All evidence winds up pointing to Dokes being the Bay Harbor Butcher and police finding his body along with another victim Dexter had happened to kill at that cabin. And everything works out great until Lila pops back up. Dexter convinces her that he's going to run away with her. And then she's super excited about it because she had been doing everything she could think of to get back with him, including wrongfully accusing Detective Batista of some really terrible things and only willing to drop it if Dexter got back with her, which is like super, super crazy. And, just generally toxic stuff. But right when Dexter is about to meet up with her and run away together, Deb shows up basically saying she needs to get out of town, trying to help out Batista because she knows that Batista's a good guy. She decides to play along, but takes Dexter's bag and realizes he wasn't going to run away with her. He was going to kill her. So she does what any sane person would do. She kidnaps Rita's kids and locks them and Dexter in her apartment before she lights it on fire. Then she just runs away to Paris. But Dexter saves the kids, tracks her down, getting one last kill in Paris right before flying back to Miami for the end of the season. Season 3 starts getting a bit more streamlined. Rita realizes she's pregnant. Dexter isn't exactly sure about being a dad due to his extracurricular activities and worrying he's going to turn his kid into a killer like him. Dexter winds up realizing he's got to be there for the family and proposes to Rita. Dexter winds up making a new friend, Miguel Prado, an assistant district attorney, and they bond extra hard because Miguel stumbles upon Dexter killing someone that Miguel thought murdered his brother and he was planning to kill. They become murder buddies for a bit and Dexter teaches him a few things, but not the most important bit until turns out Miguel got a little too murder happy, killing an innocent person, and Dexter had to shut things down for good. Dexter and Rita get married and everything works out. Oh, and Diggle from Arrow pops up this season to be Deb's complicated love interest. Then we have season 4, which is kind of known as a high for the series. We get a slightly different intro, which only happens once, but it's kind of funny because it's the same intro, but now Dexter is a dad, so everything has a bit of a twist. We get some interesting concepts of Dexter being almost too exhausted from being a new dad to properly be a good serial killer. Him and Rita wind up dealing with marriage life and marriage problems and trying to work through them. We get a new detective to fill the role of Detective Dokes with Detective Quinn, which is actually a really nice addition to the team, and he's mostly a solid detective, even if he does kind of bend the rules from time to time. And then Detective Lundy from the FBI pops back up, which throws Deb for a whirl because they broke up after the Bay Harbor Butcher case because he immediately had to fly to the next case and knew they could never work. But it turns out that he's retired now, and he's trying to hunt down a case that he was convinced was real, but had never had enough evidence to tie it to one person. But he referred to them as the Trinity Killer because he always kills in threes: a bathtub murder, a jumper, and a bludgeoning. Deb and Lundy start investigating. Things get rekindled and she winds up cheating on Diggle, or as he's known in the Dexter universe, Anton. And immediately after the hookup, she and Lundy are both shot by an unknown assailant. She's badly injured, but Lundy gets killed. Dexter learns about this Trinity Killer, digs through the info, and winds up finding the Trinity Killer in the act. But since Dexter isn't actually able to get to him in time, he knows that the Trinity Killer cycle is complete. So he's got time and decides he's going to learn some more about how the Trinity Killer, aka Arthur Mitchell, played expertly by John Lithgow, so damn good, managed to successfully do this for so long without being caught. So he takes on the fake persona of Kyle Butler and buddies up with Arthur, who's a father, a community volunteer, and a church deacon. Dexter even winds up saving Arthur's life at one point during this, but that facade of Arthur's begins to crack. Turns out Arthur isn't such a nice guy to his family, who are all terrified of him. Then Arthur finds out that Kyle Butler is secretly Dexter Morgan, so there's a great game of cat and mouse that happens here. Meanwhile, Miami Metro starts closing in on the Trinity Killer a bit, but Deb figures out that the person who shot her and Lundy was actually someone much shorter than who they expect the Trinity Killer to be, because they thought that the Trinity Killer shot them because Lundy was getting too close. But she winds up figuring out who the shooter was, and it turns out it's actually the Trinity Killer's illegitimate daughter, who happens to be a reporter that had been sleeping with Detective Quinn. They confront her. She kind of takes matters into her own hands a little bit by taking herself out of the equation. And then Dexter finds out that the Trinity Killer actually kills in 4s, not 3s. He's not the Trinity Killer. So he has to save the next victim and then hunts down Arthur Mitchell, putting an end to him. And all is well until Dexter gets home to find that Arthur had already taken one last victim before Dexter had finished his work. Dexter's wife, Rita, and leaving their young son, Harrison, sitting in the blood of their mother, just like Dexter had when he was 3, which is one hell of a way to end a season. Then we get season 5, which is Dexter's sort of road to recovery with an incredibly damaged woman, which is especially ironic because in Michael C. Hall's real life, he was actually dealing with recovery and women, as him and Jennifer Carpenter had gotten divorced at this time, and he was dealing with cancer treatment. So there's actually points in this season where his hair actually looks much redder than usual, and it turns out that's because he's actually wearing a wig due to his chemo treatments. But in the show, police figure out that Dexter's wife was actually killed by Arthur Mitchell, and Arthur is apparently on the run as far as they know because they can't find him. And they never will, thanks to Dexter. But Detective Quinn is kind of suspicious of Dexter, especially after the Mitchell family is interviewed and they give a sketch of Kyle Butler. Dexter is dealing with so much, he tries to take care of Harrison as well as Rita's 2 other kids as their stepdad, but it winds up being too much and the kids want to live with their grandparents. So Dexter accepts that and only takes care of Harrison while getting a nanny for some extra help. Lieutenant LaGuardia and Detective Batista just so happen to randomly get married, and Deb and Quinn get romantically involved, which is especially weird with Quinn suspecting Dexter of everything that he's suspecting him of. And then Dexter is doing a standard kill of the week, but surprise, it's not a standard kill of the week because there's a woman named Lumen locked in the guy's attic. Dexter rescues her, but at the same time kind of has to keep her captive as well because she saw too much, until she realizes Dexter is kind of a good guy when he shows her that she was supposed to be killed just like a bunch of others. But then she surprises Dexter by letting him know that it wasn't just the one guy. It was a group of men that was doing this. And she starts obsessing about it and wants to kill all the people that are involved in all the terrible things that were done to her. But there's a slight problem because she was blindfolded during most of the really horrific stuff. But she's so obsessed, she tries to hunt somebody down and almost winds up killing the wrong person. Dexter tries to get her to just go home after the mishap, but she secretly doesn't, and then finds one of the actual guys and shoots him. But since she doesn't really know what she's doing, she calls Dexter for help, who's right in the middle of a kill of the week. But since he's in the middle of it, he doesn't have time to complete the actual killing activity, so he wraps him up, keeps him drugged, and throws him in the trunk of his car, then drives off to go and help Lumen. Turns out the guy she shot isn't actually dead and is trying to escape. They catch him, and Dexter isn't sure that he's actually the one of the bad guys until when they're not quite paying close attention, the guy sneaks away and calls one of the other bad guys. And he thinks no one's listening and of course incriminates the crap out of himself so everybody can hear how terrible he is. So Dexter takes him out really quick, and because there was a gunshot earlier, cops show up to investigate, only for the other kill of the week to try and make a run for it. So Dexter has to go and chase him down. He winds up getting to him just in time and uses the extra body to help stage the scene. And Vince Masuka comes up with this overly perverted idea of what actually happened there. And apparently it was just some sort of freaky thing that had gone south. Lumen admits that she feels more at peace now that one of the bad guys is out of the picture, so Dexter agrees to hunt down the rest of them with her. They grow closer as they kill together throughout the season. Quinn is still suspicious of Dexter, so he hires an investigator to look into him. The investigator goes overboard, kidnaps Dexter, and then Dexter has to fight back and kills him. And Quinn shows up, but doesn't find anything despite a drop of blood landing on his shoe. Dexter winds up escaping that situation unseen. After Dexter escapes that investigator, he catches up with Lumen just in time to help her kill the final big bad of the season, Jordan Chase, who's a motivational speaker that enjoyed getting other bad guys to do bad things. And after they kill him, as Dexter and Lumen are cleaning up, Deb almost catches them. but decides to let them go because she's kind of figured out their story, except for the fact that Dexter is one of them. Lumen is at peace and doesn't have the urge to kill anymore, so she leaves, but that does leave Dexter pretty distraught. Then Dexter goes ahead and fakes some blood evidence to make sure that Quinn doesn't get pinned with a murder charge for something he didn't do, and everyone gets to celebrate at the end of the season for Harrison's happy birthday. Then in season 6, Batista's sister winds up becoming Dexter's nanny. LaGuardia winds up blackmailing her way in becoming the captain on the police force. Masuka hires an intern that he wants to hook up with in a really creepy way. Then he has to fire her for stealing evidence in the big case from season 1, and LaGuardia and Batista wind up getting divorced, and Deb gets labeled a hero cop after stopping a gunman in a restaurant. The deputy chief wants to screw over LaGuardia after she blackmailed him, so instead of promoting Batista to lieutenant, like everyone kind of assumed would happen, he instead promotes Deb with her new label as hero. But right before she accepts the job, Quinn proposes, she says no, and he goes on a bender of drinking and hookups. And then we get what I thought was a pretty interesting big bad killer for the season, with the Doomsday Killer being a religious professor, James Geller, and his student, Travis Marshall, played by Colin Hanks, aka Tom Hanks' son. Some people aren't the biggest fan of this killer, but I really liked him, and the whole recreating things from the Book of Revelations to bring about the end of the world was especially kind of interesting. But then it turns out that Woody's son is actually just super crazy, killed James Geller, and is going full on Fight Club as 2 people. He finds a few other zealots to help him out, then tries to chemically poison the police department, but Dexter saves everyone at the last minute. Deb starts talking to a therapist and realizes she has romantic feelings for her adoptive brother, which is where the show starts kind of going off the rails. She goes to tell Dexter, only to walk in on him killing Woody's son, and we get the "oh god" clip. Then we get season 7, starting with Deb helping Dexter cover up the murder and burning down the crime scene. And then LaGuardia checks out the scene of the fire later and finds a blood slide, which she conveniently doesn't tell anyone, but since it's the same as the slides from the Bay Harbor Butcher, she's starting to get some ideas. Deborah winds up digging in Dexter's apartment and finds his killing tools and realizes the extent of things. She forces Dexter to move in with him to keep an eye on him and keep him from killing, but realizes it won't work very well. And then Dexter winds up saving Deb from a different crazy killer and also took him out. Maybe it's not so bad to let him kind of just do his thing. There's actually a very weak big bad killer for this season with a Ukrainian mob boss, but the more important introduction this season is Hannah McKay, played by Ivana Strahovski, a killer that was on Dexter's table, but then he realizes, damn, she's kind of hot, and decides to date her instead. Deb is not a huge fan of Hannah for obvious reasons, and gets her arrested, which is kind of fair because she also poisoned Deb, and then Hannah manages to escape and go on the run. Then LaGuardia sets a trap for Dexter by getting Dexter's mother's killer released from prison and following him. You know, she's having a killer released from prison based off the hunch she has about Dexter. Granted, it's correct, but still, it's a little far. Dexter kind of catches on to this, so Dexter kills him and then lures LaGuardia to kill her, but Deb interrupts and is forced to choose between shooting LaGuardia and arresting Dexter. But we do have another season to go, so she winds up shooting Maria. Then we get season 8, which really goes off the rails and basically becomes a straight up soap opera. Deb isn't really coping well with killing LaGuardia, so she quits the police force. Meanwhile, Dexter winds up meeting a Dr. Evelyn Vogel, known as the Psychopath Whisperer. And it turns out she's the psychiatrist who helps Dexter's adoptive father come up with the code that Dexter follows. She winds up knowing who Dexter is right away, and frankly, I really don't like this character. She doesn't feel properly thought out or well written. She chats with Dexter about a new serial killer that the police refer to as the brain surgeon, who take a portion of the victim's brains. She knows it's someone connected to her, so Dexter goes hunting through a whole bunch of people connected to Dr. Vogel. Vogel winds up helping Dexter reconcile with Deb. Then Hannah McKay pops back up, and Dexter falls right back in love with her, forcing Dr. Vogel to realize he has more of a range of feelings than she initially assumed, possibly realizing that maybe he wasn't a full-blown psychopath and probably could have been treated in another way. They figure out that the brain surgeon is actually Dr. Vogel's son who faked his death years ago. Remember, full-blown soap opera style of writing at this point. Then the brain surgeon, who, by the way, has no personality and pretty much feels like a robot in this season, kills Dr. Vogel. Hannah takes Harrison on the run with her with a plan for DEXTER to meet up with them in Argentina. Dexter winds up capturing the brain surgeon, but then realizing his feelings for Hannah make him not need to kill anymore, and he just wants to run away with her. So he calls Deb to arrest him instead, which would have been great, but someone who was looking for Hannah interferes, so the brain surgeon kills that guy and shoots Deb. Basically, every time that Dexter decides to let somebody live longer than they should, they wind up hurting somebody he cares about. Deb is rushed to the hospital, and the brain surgeon shows up to try and finish the job, only for him to get arrested and then killed by Dexter. Deb winds up having a massive stroke from a blood clot and basically becomes brain dead and on life support as a hurricane approaches Miami. Full-blown soap opera. Everyone is evacuating for the hurricane, and in the chaos, Dexter takes Deb off life support, brings her to his boat, drops her body in the water just like he did with so many of his victims, then attempts to take himself out and drive his boat into the hurricane. Everyone assumes that he died, but he actually winds up surviving and decides to move to Oregon to be a lumberjack in hiding. Everyone hated this ending, and justifiably so. So that's why they came out with Dexter, New Blood, based 10 years after faking his death. Dexter is actually hanging out in a remote town in upstate New York, and he's going on a very long no-kill streak. He's got a cozy little life under the name Jim Lindsay, paying a bit of respect to the author of the original books, Jeff Lindsay. He's got a girlfriend who happens to be the local sheriff, but otherwise living a quiet life, until a douche entitled brat that happens to be the son of Mr. Krabs and has a history of getting people killed or hurt for his own recklessness decides to shoot a white stag that Dexter had a real connection with. Dexter loses it, kills him, and does what he can to cover it up. And this season is an absolute return to form. It feels like it's back to all of the best parts of Dexter. And while in older seasons, the ghost of his adoptive father would chime in from time to time to give advice, now Deb is in his head instead. She even brings back some of the dark humor from season 1, which is super refreshing. Right after Dexter kills for the first time in a long time, Harrison shows up at his door, and we find out that Hannah died of cancer a few years prior, and Harrison has been bouncing around the foster system ever since. And Harrison had actually thought that Dexter died until he found a letter from Dexter after Hannah passed, and it mentioned him being worried about Harrison having dark urges. Harrison assumes Dexter left because there was something wrong with Harrison, and Dexter's not exactly the best communicator, so he doesn't actually know how to help his son, at least not initially. A search party pushed forward by Mr. Krabs, who wants to find his son, ramps up to find the missing person, until out of nowhere, Mr. Krabs gets a call from his son, and everything is fine, which of course it isn't, because Dexter and the audience know the son is actually dead. Harrison winds up making some friends, and then when the kid who's being picked on starts planning a shooting, Harrison stops him and is played out as the hero. But Dexter, being part of a former forensic team, can't help but see that the story he gets told by Harrison doesn't make sense. And he figures out that Harrison is hiding some of his own darkness. Harrison winds up trying to cope with the entire situation by going to a party that's thrown by all of the people that would have died in the shooting. Someone gives him some drugs, and he ODs, so Dexter winds up making a point to take care of a couple of dealers while he's back to his old habits. We find out that Mr. Krabs is actually a long-running serial killer, and he's even trying to fuel the dark urges in Harrison. Dexter's girlfriend stops by a police conference in New York that just happens to be having a presentation from Batista, and they have a little chat until it happens to bring up some info that rings a little too close to Dexter, and her wheels start turning. Once she figures it out, she actually gets Dexter to help with some of the investigating, and everyone starts to figure out that Mr. Krabs is actually a bad guy at the same time. Dexter finally tells his son the truth, they bond over it, and Harrison even tags along while Dexter kills Mr. Krabs. But Harrison doesn't really react like someone who has the same dark urges that Dexter does, which, by the way, Dexter refers to him very often as his dark passenger. Then the sheriff actually puts a few too many pieces together and realizes Dexter is the one who killed Mr. Krabs' son. So she locks up Dexter, and Dexter gives us some info on the bad stuff Mr. Krabs was doing, so she runs off to investigate. Dexter uses that time to escape, trying to do so without killing anyone, but it didn't quite work out that way. He catches up with his son to go on the run together, who then realizes that Dexter doesn't always just kill bad people, because he had to have killed somebody good in order to escape jail in the first place. Dexter can't hide the truth, and he lets Harrison shoot him in the heart, which is surprisingly peaceful and well done, as the sheriff lets Harrison go and hopefully lets him start a new life. Feels like a great way to end the story, or at least I thought so. But in the trailer for the new prequel show, they hint that they're trying to bring Dexter back to life because there's another show coming out called Dexter Resurrection, on top of the prequel that's also coming out for Dexter Original Sin about him growing up. I'm honestly a little disappointed just because it felt like such a good, solid ending and a great way to finish things. But at the same time, I love Dexter, so of course I'm going to watch the new show. Although apparently there was also talks to continue Dexter New Blood as a show and follow Harrison on his journey, but that does feel also unnecessary, even more so than the Dexter Resurrection show. And I'm not sure if that actually wound up leading to anything, but I will wind up watching the prequel show for sure because that looks super good and super interesting. And I'll probably cautiously watch Dexter Resurrection. But after all of that, the weirdest thing about the entire show isn't the killing. It isn't the weird season 8 soap opera ridiculous ending. It's the main characters other than Dexter. More importantly, these ones. And some of it's about the character development and how it's acted out. How these characters reacted to things, or how they acted in general, just really feels out of place. We got Masuka, who isn't just kind of pervy in the show. It's so over the top with his comments that I don't know how anybody wasn't constantly just kind of uncomfortable around him. I'm not like woke or whatever, and even in a pre-Me Too world, this was just way too much. Even when the FBI agent Lundy comes in, he blatantly says he doesn't want to be around him because he's just so creeped out by him. But everyone around him just lets it slide 90% of the time. Hell, they even encourage it at certain points, and it's just weird and gross. Then we have Dokes.
Surprise, motherfucker.
Who's a straight up psychopath as far as anybody's concerned, with how he acts towards Dexter, and literally everybody around him sees it. He has zero evidence that Dexter is up to anything, but he harasses him, stalks him, and literally spends all of his free time obsessing about him. And why? Because he's got a feeling about him. He trusts his gut. If he had done that to a normal, innocent person as much as he did to Dexter, I'm sure they would want to headbutt him too. And of course, he does the only logical thing that anybody would do after they get so upset about the constant intrusion that they headbutt somebody. No, Dokes decides he headbutted me, so obviously I'm right. So I'm going to break into Dexter's house, ransack the place looking for evidence, and yeah, in the end, he was right. But I would have just loved if he did all that and he found nothing. And he was just left thinking, wait, am I just an asshole? Then there's LaGuerta. Now, I know she apparently got the promotions because she backstabbed and blackmailed her way to the top. But you can't do that while being so obviously bad at your job. Like, at least try to hide it a little bit. She knows Masuka is an insane perv to the point it grosses people out, and she does nothing about it. She knows Dokes is being straight up psycho, and she tries to talk to him about it because they're friends. But when there's legitimate evidence that Dokes is probably the Bay Harbor butcher, She hides the fact that he called her. All she does is promote terrible behavior within the department, even blatantly hitting on her own employee in a generally creepy way, even pre-Me Too mentality. It was pretty creepy. Then she bangs her rival lieutenant's husband to force her to have a nervous breakdown. Like, these people are all so screwed up to the point that it's hardly rational. Then there's Quinn, but actually Quinn is relatively normal, even if he does go a bit far at times. But there's an awkward, intimate scene that is branded into my mind where he's in the middle of some you-know-what and just looks so bored and doesn't really want to be doing it. I understand the point of it, but I just thought it was hilarious, so I had to call it out. But then there's Deb, who is just so unhinged so much of the time. Yes, she swears like 2 pirates fucked, and those pirates' kids had babies, and because of the incest genes, they wound up making the most swear-heavy person imaginable. But that part's not even the weird part. And I can even understand that she probably had some daddy issues because her dad had to worry so much about Dexter, the serial killer in training in their house. But even besides that, she goes so far off the rails so often, whether it's her dating life, because remember, she got engaged to a guy she barely knew who turned out to be a serial killer, or her falling for her own adoptive brother, like it's something straight out of a certain part of the internet. Her response is to basically everything when she's the one who's supposed to be doing the responding and not just being some background person. It's straight up bipolar most of the time. Did I mention that she loves her brother? But some of her extreme reactions could be partially due to the directors or showrunners throughout the lifetime of this show, because there's tons of times where they tell actors, go all out and we'll dial it back if we need to. And then they just thought, nope, that's fine. And then they moved on. Frankly, there's only like 2 normal people in this show. And one of them is Detective Batista, who is definitely a flawed person, don't get me wrong, but he at least feels real. And then there's FBI Agent Lundy, who literally calls out most of the terrible behavior. He calls out Masuka, who he's so grossed out by he won't work with, Dokes, who he thinks doesn't work well with others and is so unhinged he thinks he's a serial killer, LaGuerta for being all around bad at her job, and Deb for being into a guy that's older than her own dad. But Lundy was way too logical, so they had to kill him off. Honestly, some of these things feel like they're just a product of the time. Like when you watch people kiss in really old movies by just mashing their faces together and it doesn't feel natural, but these people's personalities are just so unhinged that it doesn't feel real at times. But Dexter New Blood actually fixed most of this because it felt like it had way more realistic depictions of characters. And I'm super curious to know how things are going to be done with Dexter Original Sin. And despite liking the finality of New Blood, I will still at least check out Dexter Resurrection. But have you watched Dexter already? Are you going to watch the multiple new series coming out? You know what? Just let me know in the comments. And I'm that guy RJ, that's just my opinion, and I just wanted a reason to rant about Dexter for an unreasonably long time.